भट्ट साहब तकरीर
I'm the only message here.
राना साहब तकरीर करवाओ ना भट्ट साहब को
Rana साहब फोटो ला लो. You gonna come here?
हाँ जी बोलें भट्ट साहब
शुक्रिया.
प्लीज कैरी ऑन
No,
what's
don't
your
ca-
what's your
don't-
point
no,
of view
don't carry on because I'm using my ladder to speak.
Oh,
You
sorry.
can use that box over there. It's
Oh,
fine.
we
Yeah,
go.
that's what I'm saying. My ladder. Yeah.
On ladder चाहिए पड़े.
चलो ले जाओ फिर
Take that box over there. Take the box. Put it over there somewhere.
No problem. ये तो सामान यूज नहीं
No,
करना.
he wants his ladder back now
Oh, you want his ladder back?
तकरीर कर लो ना
नहीं बस हो गई.
क्यों नहीं
जैसे बाकी बंदे
I want his jog back. I want my ladder back. Same thing.
Yeah.
Although the Americans didn't take mine.
राना साहब तुसी कोई बार कुछ.
So I've been speaking here since the end of 1985. Come in a wee bit, and I'll come to you a wee bit. There have been many things I've been speaking about over the years. I've been trying to work out how to understand the dynamics of what's been happening in the world in the last couple of years, but also for a much longer period of time. I've been involved in politics since I was 17 years of age. And the war in Ukraine, the global economic crisis, and the pandemic and consequences of the pandemic. Those are the sort of themes that I focus on during the course of this meeting. So I think it's important to go back a little bit in time to get a perspective on the dynamics we've seen, or the background to the dynamics we're seeing today, in order to understand where we're at and where we're going. And of course that's an important thing to do, even if it's the perspective you might not agree with the theoretical perspective, it still might offer you some insight to allow you to view something from a different angle. If you really want to understand something, you have to look at it from different perspectives, you know. That's why the police van has got cameras in different directions to spy on us, to see what's going on. You know, it's not adequate just to have one camera. They have to have different angles to view things from. And of course, the police infamously, our friend here, Leon, his films used to be watched every single week. He kept about 5 police officers busy every week watching his films to see what was going on at Speaker's Corner. And so my perspective comes from Marxism, and it's a method of analysis based on how the economic wealth of society is produced and how it's distributed, who gets what and who controls what. And that doesn't mean you have to agree with what I say to be able to benefit from understanding that this provides as to one method of analysing and assessing the world. And sometimes I get things completely wrong, other times I might get things right, and you can weigh it up at Speaker's Corner. Did this guy say what he said, was it valid? And was what he said valid because of the method he used, or just a chance? You know, I might say, oh, tomorrow's going to be sunny, and not have any idea about meteorology, or just guess it. And it might be sunny, it doesn't make me prophetic because it happens to be sunny. So it could be my method's completely wrong. I leave you to decide on that question. So basically the method is this. By analysing the distribution of wealth and power and the reproduction of that distribution of wealth and power, we can understand a great deal about the way the world is organised. The capitalist system dominates, in my opinion, 2/3 or more, or 70%, 80% of the world. In China, Cuba, and a couple of other countries, there are exceptions. Those regimes do not operate the same way, for the very simple reason because economic ownership is organised differently, and as a consequence of different economic ownership, you have different political power. In China, economic ownership is publicly owned at the decisive levers of the economy. In the West, economic ownership is privately owned at the decisive levers of the economy. What difference does this make? It means that in the West, the people who control the Western world are private owners of the means of producing wealth. The big tech companies, the big banks, the big pharmaceutical companies, the big entertainment industries, the big hedge funds, the privately owned large-scale enterprises which dominate world trade, world production, world distribution, also dominate the governments of the Western world, which in the most democratic of Western governments also constitutes a form of dictatorial power over the people, despite the fact they have different political parties standing for office.
That's right.
So we have a sort of sham democracy in the West, whereby we think we're voting for different political parties, but they carry out the same policies. Effectively, there are different factions which represent different factions of the ruling class. One faction has one group of interests, so the tourism industry clearly had no interest in promoting the pandemic agenda, whereas the pharmaceutical industry clearly had a lot of interest in promoting the pandemic COVID dictatorship regimes, or dictatorial regimes in the name and justified by COVID. And so different factions put pressure to secure different objectives from governments. And of course, even though in the Western world private ownership dominates the economy, still what the real objective of a lot of private owned companies is to secure massive state subsidies for their pet projects. So instead of trying to make a profit by going onto a marketplace like Portobello Road and selling what you've got, hoping you're going to do okay, the decisive companies in the world, from different factions, they go to the marketplace and they say, government, give me the money from the taxpayers to buy my products. And in that way, I'm guaranteed profits from state investment. And there are many companies that are, for example, the arms industry. The arms industry for 100 years has been dependent upon subsidy. In fact, from 1914, has been dependent on massive subsidies from the people through the state, transferred to the arms industry. And they played the oil industry, monopolised industry, oligopolised industry. It gets massive subsidies from the state to operate. And on many occasions in the 20th century and the 21st century, war has been fought for oil and gas, right? So we know these things. And therefore, you'll have a huge mobilisation of resources to conquer other countries in order to secure resources for key countries and key economic players in those countries. Now, what does this mean? Well, in the last few years, we've had a number of mission-based campaigns. And what this means is that key capitalist enterprises and networks of enterprises get together and they discuss what agenda they can promote with PR companies, with finance. You know, they've got massive machinery. You know, you and I get together to try and do something. We have to arrange a time we're going to meet, a place we're going to meet, hire a venue, discuss ideas, work out how we're going to mobilise our little few people, make some leaflets, make some posters, that type of thing. But if you've got billions of pounds, you just employ people. You scour the world for the greatest brains to advertise your products, to advertise your campaigns, to promote your campaigns, to lobby members of parliament, to lobby political parties, to lobby nations, to lobby the United Nations, to lobby international NGOs, to push forward your agenda. So what are the two key agendas? You've got oil and gas in the past and the military. But in the last few years, we've had a shift towards climate change and the climate change agenda, and pandemics and the health agenda. And these two networks and alliances of giant enterprises, global enterprises, based, however, in the most advanced capitalist countries, what used to be called the imperial heartlands. England, Europe, America, Canada, Australia, Japan. These countries had the decisive levers of economic power in the Western world, and they use that power to push forward their own agendas. And when they do so, They have enormous resources at their disposal. In Britain, we've got universities, some of the best universities in the world. In America, they've got universities linked to scientific centres, technological, healthcare, biotechnology, nanotechnology, all receiving huge resources from the private sector and the government. And this symbiosis between the private sector and the government explains much of what we've seen in the last 2 years and the last 10 years. On the climate agenda, everywhere in the world you hear repeated in the news and the newspapers and the television, you hear repeated. The science says. That's the phrase of our era. The science says. Science is a method. It's a little bit loud. Nick! I'm going to move a little bit, sorry.
So we should all arm ourselves with the Chinese. My father was a soldier in the Second World War. That's the Constitutes.
I'm gonna move it.
So they push this agenda that says, the science says. The science is always something that they cobble together and construct a vision about what scientific truth is. Science is the pursuit of truth. It attempts to use natural scientific, sometimes mathematical models, sometimes theoretical models, to postulate on the basis of evidence whether something is true or false. Now, the problem is that there are, for example, during the pandemic, there were 700, this by the summer of last year, there were 700,000 scientists who wrote papers that were peer-reviewed, in peer-reviewed documents, that were published on the pandemic. Now, how could anybody possibly read all that output of data? And how could all the output of data constitute the science? What it constitutes is the views of many scientists. That isn't the science. It's a set of interpretations by hundreds of thousands of people, publishing over 500,000 documents claiming to know what is going on in the world in relation to the pandemic. Now, in relation to climate change, it's the same thing. You've got an army of people employed full-time to produce research work that tends to reaffirm the official agenda and the official view of the science. And that official view and agenda is created by networks of corporate entities linked to government and international NGOs who have an interest in promoting a specific method of analysis, a specific set of measures which correspond with their own economic and financial plans. So, now I'm not saying they're necessarily dominant. Personally, I think that in the last 2 months, the so-called climate change agenda of the elite, by that I mean people like, Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum and the World Wildlife Fund and the United Nations, etc., the IPCC, many government institutions that are linked in with the ecological policies. But of course, I believe that those ideas, this thing about net zero, massive reductions in CO2, and all the arguments associated with it, I think they've been given a body blow over the last 2 months by war. The war has totally undermined the entire structure of their arguments. Suddenly, oil and gas are at the centre of everybody's interest. Price rises are skyrocketing all around the world, and by the way, there's 2 parts to this. One of it is the debts accumulated during the pandemic. The other of it is the oil and gas shortages and the food shortages and the fertilizer shortages following from the war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine as a proxy for many powers that are throwing their weight behind the Ukrainian army.
One of the problems with this kind of science, which is actually completely irrational, is they draw graphs saying human CO2 consumption and temperature, but the correlation does not mean causation. But just because there's a correlation or two graphs that are similar doesn't mean these two have caused each other. Because at the same, first of all, they've only been keeping records for 150 years or something like that. And the second point is, if they were to draw another graph, sun's activities, because sun is not constant in his activities. Sometimes the sun's activities goes up, sometimes the sun's activities goes down. If you draw a correlation between the sun's activities and temperature rises, it's just the same, it's an exact match. So how do you know if it's CO2 or if it's the sun's activities?
What I would say is that you're perfectly correct in this, is the tendency, and you'll see this in climate science and you see it in pandemic science, is they have a chart like this and then suddenly goes, "Ah!" like Adolf Hitler salute, right? Suddenly it's going through the roof and everyone's going to die, right? Everyone's going to die from COVID or with COVID, everyone's going to die from climate or with climate. You know, I attended the protest a couple of weeks back of the Extinction Rebellion people. And they were marching. It was quite a nice looking march, very colourful, lots of sound, lots of drums. It's a good theatre. And of course it is a theatre. Now I'm not opposed to using theatre in protest. I think it's a good thing, and it always has been. And clearly there's some people who are advising Extinction Rebellion quite well about how to organise a hullabaloo and get a lot of attention. I don't think there's any doubt, and it's something to be praised in one way, because they've been able to utilise these methods, which combine together all types of theatrics, and make their name known. That's perfectly true. But I saw them, I followed them down the road there as they were marching along, and they stood at the front there with their banner, and quite a, aesthetically pleasing gang at the front. And I looked at them and they were shouting, "The seas are rising, and so are we. Oh no, oceans are rising, and so are we." Well, now, to go from CO2 causing an increase in temperature in, for example, a vacuum or a jar, and then to say that the entire planet, CO2 drives temperature increases, and then to say from that CO2 temperature increases cause the melting of the ice caps, which cause the rising of the sea, which cause floods everywhere, which cause storms, which cause volcanoes, or which cause cold weather, hot weather. I just have this tendency, like the three bears, not too hot, not too cold. The porridge. What is the right temperature for the Earth? Is there a record of that? Is there somewhere written down by God or Jesus Christ or Muhammad or some special scientist, Michael Mann, the man with the hockey stick, what the right temperature is or what the right sea level is? The only argument they have is that there is something going on at this level that will eventually become like Adolf Hitler's salute and shoot up into the heavens, and all man will be destroyed within 20 years. So they say, I spoke to many of them, and they say, the sixth extinction is coming. Everyone's gonna die, the planet's gonna die, the animals gonna die, Earth is gonna become unlivable. They've been saying that for quite a while. But not only that, been arguing various arguments. I think this is stretching credulity beyond any reasonable scientific thinking. Science is not about just extrapolating computer models that predict exponential growth of whatever factor you've got. There are multiple factors involved in any scientific prediction which involves complex life, complex natural phenomena, and complex organic phenomena. Now, what does it mean, looking at rising seas? They say the seas are rising, what is it, half a millimetre a year? And they keep, you know, when they show pictures, you know, we get complained about when we say something on the internet that it doesn't agree with the official line. Then you get a message on there, this is not correct, this is not correct, this is not correct. And yet the Guardian newspaper and the BBC, regularly when there's a climate science issue, they will post a picture of Big Ben underwater. And only Big Ben poking out the top. You know, the clock, I did recognise it. Big Ben.
Subliminal photography, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah, Big Ben poking out of a clock. Or the Statue of Liberty, head up to the head in water. Now, is that not a falsification of reality? There is no possibility that the Statue of Liberty or Big Ben will be underwater up to its neck. No possibility whatsoever. In fact, I've got newspapers from the 1840s. 1849, there was a massive flood in London at the earliest phases of the Industrial Revolution. And floods, they show, remember the floods in Germany a couple of years back. There we go, oh, the floods in Germany, caused by climate change. The fires in Australia, caused by climate change. The fires in Indonesia, caused by climate change. The fires in Brazil, caused by climate change. The fires in Los Angeles, caused by climate change. Is it all caused by climate change, really? You know, we've had this story about COVID deaths. Is the excess death rate in the world, as guessed by certain medical institutions, the actual death rate of COVID, or from COVID, or with COVID? No one's saying it is. What they're saying is excess deaths occurred. Then there's the question of, did you die with or from? Well, in China at the moment, there are many psychotic things being done in China at the moment. But one thing that is not psychotic about what they're doing is that when they say someone has died from COVID, they've got a test for it. And it's not, did you have a positive PCR test 28 days before, or less than 28 days. What they say is, are your lungs suffering from pneumonia visible in broken glass-like opacities in the lungs? And that, if you have that, when you die in China, they say you're a COVID death. That's how you count. A CT scan of the lungs with broken glass-like opacities appearing.
It's the same as SARS, basically, which did
That
start
is
in
exactly
East
the same
Asia.
feature as SARS.
Yeah.
Exactly the same features as SARS. So that's what they counted as a COVID death. I think that's a reasonable starting method for analysing whether it's a COVID death. But in the West they're complaining because they used for 2 years the following method. If you test positive, you got stage 4 cancer, you test positive for SARS-CoV-2, within 28 days of your death, you count as a COVID death with COVID. So there have been disputes about this. It's an international discussion about what constitutes a COVID death. But what constitutes climate change caused by man? Is it any single event anywhere where an animal dies? You know, they show pictures of polar bears starving to death on a piece of ice,
Yeah,
and
and
they
actually,
say,
Mr. Speaker,
and they
polar
always,
bears are actually multiplying in the North Pole.
Yes,
the
apparently-
Green Lobby is
apparently
totally wrong,
there are
as
more
usual.
polar bears now
The
than
idiots
ever
that
before.
support every Green Party in every Western
Of course they can
country
swim.
are as
But the
dumb
point
as
is, when
fucking
people
shite.
see a picture of an emaciated, dying polar bear, polar bears die like any other animal. They get disease and some cancer and things like they get like we do. And they're going to get an emaciated polar bear sitting on a piece of ice, and they're making out this piece of ice has drifted out to nowhere, and the poor polar
some
bear is
have actually
dying
moved
of
into central
starvation
Canada
because he's on a
because
piece
it's
of ice.
slightly wilder.
But as you're right, they jump. And you're correct.
They have.
The polar bears have been moving south
Canada
in
is
Canada,
relatively
moving into urban areas and breeding with grizzly bears.
Yeah.
So, but this is part of the natural process
Correct.
of animal behaviour. It's not evidence of climate change. And it can't be evidence of climate change. And yet it is the poster child of the climate change agenda. So I wish there were a bit more genuine science involved, and then we might be able to discuss it. The problem is, when Piers, for example, was invited onto Talk
Labour
Radio,
Party's so late on the green
onto
issue.
Talk Radio a little while ago, suddenly, the moment he gets to Talk Radio, they ban him. If we ask them to debate, Extinction Rebellion said, "Will you prepare to debate?"
Technical problem.
They run away from the debate. When we asked the pandemic experts, Chris Whitty, we asked him questions, myself and Piers, at a meeting at the Museum of London. Does he answer the question? No, he runs away and he calls the police. This man here, myself, get grabbed and dragged out by the police, and they threaten us with arrest if we don't leave the area immediately for asking Chris Whitty a question. And yet for 2 years this man appeared on television in front of your screens and nearly every day telling you what the truth was. Yet we're not allowed to, or every person in the country will have sat there and thought, oh, but what about? And yet no one was allowed to ask a question. Not even a question.
That's right.
Now, if you put some... Oh, please.
No, this is this.
Cut a hole in that. Cut a hole in that, mate.
Can I add something?
I see the theatrics. Here we have more theatrics
Mr. Speaker, in
from the pandemic skeptic. So they appear on television and they are sworn as God spelled truth. Who did they appear with? Boris Johnson. What do we know about Boris Johnson?
the country voted for a liar.
He obviously never believed a word of it. Otherwise he would not have had all these parties going on in Downing Street, because it's quite clear that they didn't believe it. They were telling you one thing which they themselves did not believe. And yet many people around the country were scared into submission, into obeying the restrictions and regulations that were imposed on society in the name of supposedly fighting COVID. Now, I won't go into more detail about that for the minute, because a lot of you have had my point of view on this. One thing I did want to talk about quickly was Shanghai today, because China is in a bind. I don't dispute. And China is my subject. I used to be a journalist with the Chinese press from 2009 until 2020. I used to write for the government website china.org.cn, which was the State Council, that the Cabinet Office website. It's like the BBC of China. I used to be a journalist with the Chinese media. And I've not been published by them for a couple of years because they didn't like the articles I was posting, and then they basically just said, we're not going to publish these things. So I stopped submitting because it became a bit of a waste of my time. But what is my view of what's going on in Shanghai? First thing that's interesting is the evidential information that's coming out of Shanghai. Of the people tested positive, they went around testing everybody in Shanghai. Some of them 4, 5, 10 times. Everybody in Shanghai got tested, which I think is psychotic, but they did it. Now, when they did it, what did they find? They found that 90% of people in Shanghai who test positive for SARS-CoV-2 with a PCR test are asymptomatic. 90%. Now that's the highest in the world. All the other countries that have done tests have shown an average, in fact there was 27 million generic tests on people who were not tested because they were ill, but tested because they might be in contact, or there was a testing regime, schools, colleges, workplaces and so on. And they found around 43% in the rest of the world were asymptomatic. Now, how do you explain that double the percentage of people in China are asymptomatic, and yet apparently China got rid of COVID in 2020, early in 2020? Clearly, something has made them, something has made them have antibody seroprevalence higher than anywhere else in the world. I suggest to you there could be two possible explanations. One is people were already immune. Two is from one reason or another.
Best
And I'll explain
economy for the
why.
last 30 years, Mr. Speaker.
The second reason could be is that the vaccines in China work. That's the second possibility. However, the evidence from I saw published in the Financial Times claimed that the Sinovac vaccine, the dominant vaccine in China, which is an inactivated virus, that virus has a lower efficacy, supposedly, than Pfizer and Moderna, except if you had 3 doses, which most people haven't, and then it has the same efficacy as Pfizer. Now, in the Financial Times yesterday and the day before, they were saying the Chinese should take Pfizer now, and that will strengthen their protection. I don't think the evidence is there for that at all. I think, on the contrary, what the evidence points to is that there is some kind of background immunity in China. Now, why might this be? In my knowledge, and I lived in China a number of years, and I've studied China for 30 and more years, the urban population of China has nearly doubled in those 30 years. And that's people who came from the countryside, who grew up in villages, in an ambient full of animals, and connected with wild animals, where people even ate wild animals if they caught them. When I was 1990, when I was in Guangzhou, I remember going around the marketplace. It was like a zoo. There were wild animals of all sorts on the marketplace. Civet cats, which were later blamed for SARS-CoV-1. Pangolins, which at one time were blamed for SARS-CoV-2. Mink, don't forget, they killed 17 million mink in Holland when they found nearly 90% of them had got SARS-CoV-2 positive antibodies.
It shows humanity continues to abuse non-human species.
Of course they do, yes.
And it's a case for a new genocide.
But if people came from the countryside and moved to the cities, they would have had all the contact with animals that provides them, possibly with some illnesses, but also provides them through those illnesses with some level of immunity to different types of diseases, less prevalent in the cities. And so I put it to you that the reason why the Chinese population have such a low rate of death and infection, or death and illness, severe illness, with SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 is because they have some background immunity from SARS, SARS-CoV-2 or similar viruses that have been in circulation between man and animal in the countryside in China for at least 30 years and have moved to the cities and brought those protections and illnesses with them. So that's my theoretical postulation. I'm not saying it's true. It's a theoretical proposition, a suggestion that I can back up with evidence from the dynamics of the migration of people in China. Go on.
The whole Wuhan laboratory thing about...
Yeah, I think it's nonsense. It's funny because I'm being very careful in my wording about what I'm saying because I want this to remain on YouTube, and in doing so, I might change that later, but in doing so, you should take note that the number one fake news story of the pandemic was it was invented by a lab by the Chinese. That's the number one fake news story. And we can prove this because we know that a study was carried out by China's leading epidemiologist, Zhong Nanshan, published on Cornell University website in 2013, which examined children who had been hospitalized in Guangzhou between 2010 and 12, 20% of which had antibodies to SARS. So if they had antibodies to SARS in 2012, 7 years after SARS disappeared, then surely that indicates that there's some immunity circulating in the population and some low-level disease circulating in the population that could provide them with immunity, which might lead to the 80% or 90% asymptomatic in Shanghai. One quick point I want to make. Last week I pointed out that 40% of over 60-year-olds in China are unvaccinated. Now, they took, and I did a research on this last week, there's a Chinese professor, Bo Li, his name is, and he's one of the heroes of the SARS campaign in China, SARS-CoV-2 campaign in China. And he is a Chinese traditional medicine expert. And in a Chinese traditional medicine hospital, they found that a particular type of leaf they think has protective properties against SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. That's a claim by the Chinese, because they treated 90% of all COVID patients in China were treated with Chinese traditional medicine. So you can't disprove it, because everybody in China got it. Well, 9 out of 10. But what is peculiar is that in Shanghai, I saw the figures yesterday or the day before in the Financial Times, only 38% of people over 60 in Shanghai have been vaccinated. 38%. So the overwhelming majority of Chinese people in the biggest and most educated city in China, Shanghai, only, some 38% are not vaccinated. In other words, 62% are vaccinated. Sorry, are not vaccinated. Are not vaccinated.
62%
And then they,
not jabbed.
62% not jabbed. And so they said in the news, oh, but these Chinese people are not jabbed. That's the problem. But there's only 30, yesterday I think it was 36 died. 36 nothing. In the scale of Shanghai, 26 million people. It's hardly anything. Far more people, 4 or 5 times the number, attributed to have died in England in the last few days. And they said, yeah, but they're not vaccinated in China. Yeah, but the majority is not vaccinated in China. Of those sections of the population, the over 60s. So those who are said to be vulnerable are refusing vaccination. Now, when Piers Corbyn came here, in May 2020 and organised a protest against the measures taken to lock people down in Britain, in China they had only just come out of lockdown. And they said they arrested him. Later I was arrested, other people have been arrested. Hundreds and hundreds of people were arrested around the country in Britain. And when we went on demonstrations or came to Hyde Park, the police waded in with batons and attacked us, week in, week out, until we beat them back and defeated them.
Don't vote Labour or Conservative. Wake
And
up.
yet,
They're all traitors.
suddenly, although that never made the news, the only time it made the news in Britain was when they said, we attacked the police. Police suffer an attack by rioters, anti-lockdown rioters, anti-vaxxers have launched violence against the police when it was they who launched violence against us. That was the news in democratic, free press Britain. But if you look in the BBC today, or on ITV, or on Channel 4, or in the Financial Times, or in The Guardian, The Independent, The Sun, The Express, The Daily Mail, they're all screaming. In Shanghai, people are starving and protesting. In Shanghai, people are complaining. A government minister berated in Shanghai. People shouting out their windows in Shanghai. Why is it good to protest against lockdown measures in Shanghai and bad to protest against lockdown measures in Britain? Why? How do you figure that in democratic Western countries we're
They
not
don't
allowed to
exist,
protest
Mr.
and
Speaker.
complain? But in
Democracy
China,
is an illusion.
which clearly is a dictatorship, they are welcome to protest and complain. And the interesting thing is the speed at which they protested. It took months of lockdown here for people to take to the streets. It took a few weeks of lockdown in Shanghai for people to take to the streets. Why is this the case? It is because there is a lie in the Western world that Chinese people are passive ants controlled by a government who has them, orders them, do this, do that, and they jump, jump, jump. That is not how China is. China has a militant working class who moved to the cities. In the period of 30 years, 300 to 400 million people moved to the cities. Their living standards improved. Their working conditions improved. They became urban citizens. And in doing so, they felt they were strong as workers. They were powerful. They could move from one job to another. They could move from one city to another, trying to improve their lot and trying to improve the lot of their families back home. And that means that the Chinese working class is similar in its psychology to the working class of Britain, France, Germany, Italy in the 1960s. in advance of the uprisings which took place and the protests which took place in the 1960s and the 1970s. Whereas we are in societies that have gone into decline, long-term decline. And the consequence of that is the working class have been battered. Miners' strike, defeats from Tory governments, Labour government betrayals, living standards wavering, barely improving. And the consequence of that is a weakening of the organised labour movement. In 1980, about 40% of the workforce were in the trade unions. Now it's about 25%. I'll come to that in a minute. About 25%. So I believe that the country to watch at the moment for the dynamics, it's very important to watch what happens in relation to COVID. It's important in relation to world trade and world economics and world politics and the conflict in Ukraine. But it's also important to watch how the workers of China move, because the fate of the world will be determined by the way the Chinese workers respond to the regime and the way it behaves towards them. If the living standards are pushed down, if they try to privatise the economy, if they try to sell it off and create a Western democratic regime, there could be an uprising in China by the people against that. And that would place them in command of society, rather than these passive, controlled people that we're supposed to imagine exist. And I put it to you that it is the militancy and determination of the workers that causes the government to maintain a policy called communism or socialism. When they say socialism, they mean we're doing something to improve the lot. Why are we doing it? Because we fear the masses. We're scared of the working class. And that, of course, in my opinion, coming back, and I'll finish on this, why were the lockdown measures dropped in Britain? It was because of the protest movement.
Yes.
And that protest movement,
We did it.
what was it about the protest movement? Every month there was a protest, the worldwide protest for freedom it was called or whatever. And it became a huge force. All across Europe there were protests taking place. In Germany every Monday night. In Austria, one time after another. Austrians don't normally protest, and yet they had a dictatorship imposed upon them. The unvaxxed couldn't leave home. If you didn't get a vaccine, they said, we may put you in prison if you don't pay fines for leaving home without a vaccine. They abolished that. In Germany, they were contemplating a mandate. In Britain, they threatened a mandate against all NHS workers and imposed a mandate against social care workers. And then what happened was a demonstration occurred in which about 7,000 to 10,000 NHS workers joined the protest of the so-called anti-vaxxer, Piers Corbyn and his allies. And that is when the government gave in and capitulated. Suddenly they reported it. They didn't say it was an anti-vax protest. Suddenly it was an NHS protest. The British government dropped all the regulations. And then like 9 pins, one country after another dropped the regulations because they fear the masses. That is why do not believe we are not strong. Do not believe we cannot win. Do not believe the power of the people cannot defeat the regimes. It is what will defeat every regime in the world.
Thank you.
We can win. We can win.
Okay.
Can win.
We can win. We will win. We will win. We will win.